1 moving chess pieces. Marine 1 main cabins 08.0 1.2022 0800. President Vincent Zachary Quinn of the United States of America watched as his helicopter descended towards Tern Island. Located in the state of Hawaii, this island had been a nature preserve until a couple of months ago. But then the Stargate program had pulled off a miracle. Years ago, a group of people led by Colonel Everett Young had ended up stranded on an alien starship called Destiny. There was more, much more to the story. But the part that mattered right now was the fact that they had found a way back home. And that was brewing up some major changes in 2 galaxies. The helicopter hit the tarmac and Quinn disembarked. A group of 5 people was waiting for him. Normally, it took the International Oversight Authority ages to decide things. But by putting these 5 representatives in charge of the treaty negotiations, they had been able to hammer out a treaty in 2 weeks, which was warp speed by diplomatic standards. The group consisted of the British Reginald Jones, the American Dr. Ingrid Anders, the Russian Boris Grankin, the French Henry Valley, and finally, the Chinese Kui Han. They had originally been low-ranking members of the IOA who had been sent to serve as political cannon fodder. But they had used their common sense to beat the odds, and they were still here. In fact, they had all gotten promoted. Jones had been a file clerk, Anders had been low-level researcher, Grankin had been a cook, Valley had been a cook, and Han had been a nurse. But at the insistence of several key people, including Quinn, they had all been promoted to a new title of negotiator and had been given a major pay rise. "Mr. President," Jones said. "Ladies and gentlemen," Quinn said with a nod. He looked at the group and smiled. They were all wearing the Hope Base uniforms, which has a good example of what these people apart from the rest of the IOA. Other representatives would have shown up in fancy suits, with fancy shoes. But this team had simply blended in and gone to work, which was to oversee the research and development being done at this base. As for the uniforms, Hope Base used the same uniforms as Stargate Command. The only difference was the shoulder patches, which were black with Hope Base in silver letters. "So, how are things going here?" "Well, we're learning tons of stuff, but it's slow going taking the siege ship apart," Jones paused. "And putting it back together, not going to happen, sir." "Understood." The plan was for them to integrate what they learned into the X-305, Earth's next generation of starships. But there was more to the treaty than Hope Base. When Destiny's crew had come back, Earth had been defended by a 304-class ship called USS Prometheus and an Aurora-class ship called the Tria. The Tria had been a gift from a friendly group of replicators called the New Assurans. Meanwhile, the rest of the Milky Way galaxy was patrolled by 4 more 304-class ships. USS George Hammond and USS Odyssey were U.S. Air Force ships, while the RFS Korolev was Russian and Sun Tzu belonged to China. Russia and China also operated the Tria together. Finally, the USS Daedalus and USS Apollo patrolled the Pegasus Galaxy. The Pegasus Galaxy was home to a species called the Wraith. The Wraith feed on humans by consuming their life energy. This had led to a long war between the Wraith and the Tauri and their allies. That war had ended in 2010 when the Atlantis expedition had found a way to force the Wraith to sign a treaty. They had also been forced to cede half of the Pegasus Galaxy. But treaty of no treaty, the IOA did not trust the Wraith as far as they could throw them. They figured that the Wraith had only signed the treaty to buy themselves time to replenish their numbers. So they had wanted the Destiny Treaty to prepare Atlantis and the Pegasus Galaxy fleet to go sideways big time. "I heard a rumor that the shakedown cruise for the Austerlitz went well, sir," Valley said. "She's fully functional and ready to join the Earth fleet." Funded by the European Union, construction of the European Union's starship Austerlitz had begun in 2009. But then, Atlantis had returned to the Pegasus Galaxy, and the work had grounded to a halt. It had resumed several months later, but had grounded to a halt again when the funds had been diverted to upgrade the beta site. And what had not been needed there had been needed for the redevelopment of friendly Pegasus Galaxy planet called Saita. But the Destiny crew had not come back alone. They had also brought along 21 alien starships. The first was called the Freedom Alliance Starship Chaser, a coalition of friendly races which included Stargate Command. It took its name from Freedom Prime, its official capital planet. But because that planet was in another galaxy, Earth was running the Milky Way branch. Ship number 2 was called the Spira. It had been built by a race called the Ancients. Now gone, these were the folks who had invented the Stargates and built Destiny. Spira had been the backup for Destiny, which had been zapped back to Earth. The remaining 19 ships had been ancient seed ships. These ships had traveled ahead of Destiny and built Stargates. This had been the core development of the new Destiny Treaty. At some discussion with the political leaders on Freedom Prime, the IOA team had managed to negotiate a starship trading deal. First, the Chaser had been sold to the USAF. Renamed the USS Chaser, it had gotten a new crew and replaced the USS Prometheus on Earth Guard duty. And as Quinn had said, the EUS Austerlitz had also joined the Earth fleet. This had been this only way to balance things to keep all the brass happy. Tilda, 1 American ship, 1 Russian/Chinese vessel, and 1 European starship. Tilda, Quinn thought. Tilda and Prometheus is on her way to the Pegasus Galaxy. Tilda with Colonel Everett Young as her new commanding officer and a freshly promoted Captain Matthew Scott as her new chief pilot. Secretly, Quinn suspected it wouldn't be long until young Mr. Scott made major. Of course, that didn't matter to the treaty. Next to the schedule had been selling Spira. Like the Chaser, it had renamed to USS Spira. USS Spira had been assigned to patrol the Milky Way galaxy to replace the USS George Hammond. Tilda and another ship sails off to the Pegasus Galaxy. Tilda finally, there had been the 19 ships to deal with. To pay for the Chaser and Spira, the U.S. government had sold Turn Island to the people of Freedom Prime. A naval base during World War II, the island already came with abandoned buildings and a runway. The surface buildings had been torn down and replaced, while the tarmac had been resurfaced. After that, a large hangar had been carved out underneath the island. This was where the siege ship that they were studying here was being held. So the oversight team led the way to one of the hangars, where there was a secure elevator. It was big enough to hold 30 people, so they all fit inside with ease. "Going down," Han said as she pushed the button. The elevator doors closed and the cart zipped down. It only took a couple of seconds to reach the hangar. The doors opened and they stepped onto a walkway. Quinn whistled at the sight of the ancient vessel. Because Spira and Chaser were now U.S. Air Force starships, the non-human crew members of those 2 ships had needed a new assignment, and Hope Base had suited the bill. But the treaty had also said that the IOA would boost the complement of Hope Base by assigning people. So the bulk of the group that originally had been stranded on Destiny had also been assigned here. Quinn ran through the list in his head. Tilda, Captain Vanessa James, Chief of Security, and freshly promoted. Dr. Nicholas Rush as Chief Scientist. Tilda, the job had been offered to Willie Wallace, but he had turned it down. Tilda, and Major Tamara Johansson, also freshly promoted, as Chief Medical Officer. Tilda, there had been some protest about giving the job to TJ, but Doctors Carolyn Lamb and Carson Beckett had put their feet down and insisted that she was the best person for the job. And that had been the end of it. Another issue had come up regarding the presence of several former Lucian Alliance people on the base. Tilda, Jin, and Varro. Tilda, this had been a problem for some of the higher-ups in the IOA, but Quinn had pulled some strings there. "Mr. President," Nicholas Rush said as he approached the group. "Dr. Rush," Quinn began, "shall we?" Rush nodded, and they began a tour of the facility. This was Quinn's second tour of the week. Yesterday, he had visited the EUS Austerlitz and 2 more Austerlitz-class ships. The Alliance had 18 more seed ships, which they had sold to the New Assurans. As payment for the first 6, the New Assurans had finished the Austerlitz. The other 12 seed ship had bought Earth 2 more Austerlitz-class starships, which were the property of the British Commonwealth, minus the United Kingdom. Her Majesty's Commonwealth ship Victory replaced the USS Odyssey, while the HMCS Liberty was extra muscle in case the Wraith attempted to invade the Milky Way. 3 extra 304-class ships, and the IOA still doesn't think it's enough. Which was another reason why getting this treaty signed had been so easy. They wanted to get the X-305 program to the next level. Before getting on Marine One, Quinn had checked the latest reports. George Hammond, Prometheus, and Odyssey would arrive at Atlantis in 3 days, and they would not be alone. The New Assurans had agreed with the IOA. One of Atlantis' allies in the Pegasus was a human government called the Genii. They had salvaged a Lantean cruiser called the Avenger and renamed it the Pride of the Genii. The New Assurans had seen a chance to score goodwill points and had built 2 more cruisers called Defender and Vengeance, which they were donating to the Genii. As he made his way through the facility, Quinn hoped that 5 extra ships would be enough to make the Wraith think twice about whatever they were up to. Seta Valor Shipyard, 08.01.2022, 0800. While Quinn toured Hope Base on Earth, another president was touring a shipyard on Seta. In 1998, the local technology of this planet had been equal to Earth in the 1940. That year, the planet had been attacked and wiped out by the Wraith, but a handful of people had survived. And in 2010, some of them had returned to their world and begun rebuilding it. This effort had been supported by the Tory as Earth was called off-world and their allies. The first problem they had faced had been numbers. Seta had been a world of millions, but only a few hundred had returned. Fortunately for them, word had spread about their efforts, and people had arrived through the gate. First, one by one. Next had been small groups. And eventually by the hundreds, and then the thousands. By 2014, reconstruction was in full swing. That was also the year the Seta had scored a major diplomatic victory. When the Wraith peace treaty had been signed, a group called the Travelers had refused to sign it. The Travelers were a group of humans who kept out of the reach of the Wraith by living on a fleet of ships. But in 2014, the Satans had convinced them to do so. The Wraith had gloated about this, but the new Satan Alliance, as the new Satan Traveler government was called, had several tricks up their sleeves. Like the IOA, they didn't trust the Wraith either, so they had gotten to work. The civilian traveler population had been relocated to Seta. At the same time, 2 major construction projects had been kicked off. Project number 1 had been to convert an old naval shipyard into a facility capable of refitting the traveler fleet. The resulting facility had been completed in 2017 and was called Valor Shipyards. It was this base that the president of the Satan Alliance was now touring. Her name was Laren. She had been the leader of the Travelers until 2014. After the Satan Treaty had been signed, she had been elected president twice. Her first term had been from 2014 until 2018. Term number 2 had been from 2018 until 2022. And 3 days ago, she had been elected for her final term. The Constitution of the Alliance limited the president to 3 terms. But that was a 2026 problem. Today, she was inspecting the base. And checking up on the PDG. The second construction project had been a planetary defense grid. Thanks to the Tory, the Satans had already created an air force to defend their world. They had also rebuilt their army. But they had known that it would not be enough. So they were building a grid of ground-to-orbit energy weapons and missiles. These were augmented by 24 weapon satellites in orbit. Combined with the refitted and upgraded Traveler fleet, this meant that any attack against Seta would be facing a major fight. Laren walked into the office of Myro Samuels. Samuels was the director of Valor Shipyards. He was one of the few original Satans that had survived and made it back. He was in his 50s, with gray hair and brown eyes. A retired soldier, Samuels was fit, muscled, and smart. He looked up when Laren entered. "Madam President," Samuel said. "Myro," Laren began, "are our guests here?" "Yes, ma'am," Samuel said. "They are touring the Zacharias now." The flagship of the fleet, the Zacharias, was named after a legendary traveler admiral. He had commanded the fleet for 62 years, winning many battles with the Wraith. Then he had died peacefully in his sleep. It was one of 7 new ships that the fleet overhaul had allowed them to build. Samuels led the way to the dock, where the ship was receiving its final checks. They arrived just as their guests left the ship. There were 2 of them. Alex was a male New Asuran who looked like a Caucasian male with brown eyes and black hair. Their second guest was Dahlia Radum, who represented the Genii. She was the sister of Ladon Radum, their leader. Dahlia was also the ranking scientist of the Genii. "So, what do you think of our new flagship?" Laren asked. "It's impressive," Radum said. "Indeed," Alex began. "The Wraith will be unhappy when they see this beauty." "Speaking of making the Wraith unhappy," Laren looked at Alex. "What did the New Asuran leadership decide?" Alex was the commanding officer of the Orpheus, the only New Asuran ship in the Pegasus Galaxy. It was an Aurora-class ship with a mission to keep an eye on the Wraith and befriend local populations. It had arrived in 2018 and had been working in the shadows since then. Alex was the one who had convinced the New Asurans to gift the Defender and the Vengeance to the Genii. He made a face that made it clear that Laren would not like what he was about to say. "I'm afraid they made it clear they will not send any additional ships to the Pegasus Galaxy, nor will they gift any more vessels." He paused. "That said, I have the resources of the Orpheus and a few ideas brewing that I think you will like." "Let's hear them," Laren said. Alex nodded, and he set about explaining what he had in mind. A Tale of Two City Ships. M6H 987, Vanahemer 14.01.2022, 1252. Ran was an Asgard, a female Asgard. Millions of years ago, she had ascended to a higher plane of existence. Back in those days, the Asgard had still been born. Eventually, this had changed, and the Asgard had begun to reproduce by means of cloning, and that had led to problems for the species. Because the Asgard made copies of copies, their DNA had degraded. They had begun searching for a cure and had eventually discovered that humans might hold the key to fixing the damage. While the bulk of the Asgard believed that experiments on humans were wrong, there had been a tribe of Asgard who had disagreed. They had called themselves the Vanir. The Vanir had left for the Pegasus Galaxy to conduct their experiments. Alas for them, they had eventually gotten into a fight with the Wraith, and had lost, which had forced them to go into hiding for thousands of years. Until in 2008, that had no longer been an option because the place where they had been hiding had gotten really toxic. After they had left their hiding place, there had been a conflict with the Tauri. It was Ran who had ended that conflict by going back to being flesh and blood, giving the Vanir a chance of solving their genetic problems. And eventually, in 2019, they had succeeded. The reason they had done so was a species called the New Asurans. The New Asurans had secretly given the Vanir a ton of medical data. The original data had been about the ancients, but there had been a second batch of data about a group of species from a distant galaxy. Tilda the Zivalo and their genetic creations, the Nakai, the Ursini, and the Gynaco. Tilda, it had been this information that had been the key that had unlocked the cure. The cure had been administered to all the Vanir in less than a month, leaving them free to rebuild their civilization, which was exactly what they had been doing. This had been made easier because of another gift from the New Asurans. Despite what people thought, Atlantis was not the only ancient city ship in the Pegasus Galaxy. Called the Tower by the native people, there had been badly damaged city ship on a primitive planet. This world had been visited by the Colonel Shepard and his team, but had then been forgotten by the Tory. When the Satans had begun rebuilding their world, they had sent a diplomatic mission to the planet to ask them to join their populations. The locals had refused, but around the time that the Vanir had found their cure, they had changed their minds. The new Asurans had then dug up the tower and fixed it enough to fly. While Ran suspected that it had been the new Asurans who had convinced them to leave their world, she did not have any proof, nor did it matter. The new Asurans had given the tower to the Vanir, who had then completed the repairs and turned it into their capital. Renamed Vanaheimr, they had used it to relocate their entire civilization to a world the Tory called M6H 987. It was an ice planet that, until Vanaheimr had arrived, had lacked a Stargate. The lack of a gate and the icy conditions meant that it was not on the Wraith's radar, which was exactly why the Vanir had picked it. They had arrived a week ago and had finally completed settling in today, so the Vanir were having themselves a party. Ran was standing in the operations center, looking down at the gate room. The people were dancing, eating, and laughing. Tilda, about time we got a break. Tilda, it had been a hard couple of years. She was smiling as Lavos approached. General Lavos was a male and the commanding officer of the Vanir Defense Force. Madam Chancellor, Lavos said, referring to Ran by her formal title. She was the head of the civilian government of the Vanir. Glad to see you're enjoying yourself. And you, General, she said with a smile. Well, there's the diplomatic mission to Atlantis coming up, Lavos began, but I've labeled that as a tomorrow problem. As for today, he offered her his hand. Shall we dance, Madam Chancellor? I'd like that. She took his hand, and the two of them danced. Like the general had said, the mission to Atlantis could wait until tomorrow. Ran suspected that the Tory would be very surprised when they made contact. Tilda, tomorrow problem, Ran, tomorrow problem, Tilda. She smiled at the general and they continued dancing. Atlantis Operations Center, 15.01.2022, 0730. Colonel John Shepard was reading a book with his feet on one of the control consoles. The book in question was Alexander Dumas' The Count of Monte Cristo. He had finished War and Peace years ago and had worked his way through 7 novels since then. His latest read had been recommended by Richard Woolsey, the commander of the Atlantis expedition. He had just turned the page when Dr. Rodney McKay came in. When he saw Shepard, he made a face. "You forget again, didn't you?" Shepard asked while still reading. "No, I didn't," McKay began. "I was just look for you, okay, I forgot." Shepard smiled. Changes had been in the air aboard Atlantis for ages. One of the reasons had been a large-scale mission to rescue Colonel Young and the crew of Destiny. Named the Nova Roma expedition, this mission had seen the reactivation of a forgotten facility called the Deep Space Internet Facility. It had also seen Atlantis personnel, including Laura Cadman and Frank Levine, reassigned to other posts. But that was not the only change that had come since the Wraith Peace Treaty. In 2019, at the celebration of 10 years of peace in the Pegasus Galaxy, John Shepard had been promoted from lieutenant colonel to full bird colonel. And the extra ships that had arrived this year were actually the second phase of beefing up the Tory presence in the Pegasus Galaxy. Phase 1 had been the construction of a permanent Pegasus Alpha site and Pegasus Beta site. And these 2 new bases had led to more people getting reassigned. It was the most recent round of reassignments that had thrown McKay for a loop. Evan Lorne had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and was the new commanding officer of the Pegasus Alpha site, with Dr. Carson Beckett as his chief medical officer and Radek Zelenka as the chief scientist. Zelenka had been the last to leave, which had been 3 days ago. And McKay kept forgetting, which was what making Shepard smile. Tilda, he's still in the denial phase, Tilda, Shepard thought as he looked at McKay. Anyway, Yuham's gotta go, McKay said. McKay walked out and Shepard turned his attention back to his book. He got several pages further before the alarm sounded. Amelia Banks was on duty and quickly checked her controls. "Incoming wormhole, sir," Banks said as she raised the force field that protected the Stargate. "We don't have any teams off-world," Shepard said as he put the book down and his feet on the floor. He turned to Major Dorsey, who was manning one of the other consoles. "Dorsey, I want 2 extra security teams up here now." "Yes, Colonel." The security personnel already in the gate room had already readied their weapons. But there had been plenty of red flags to indicate that the Wraith were up to something in the last couple of months, so Atlantis was on a higher security status. Which was why both Dorsey and Shepard had been in the operations center. Peter Dorsey was a British soldier. He had been promoted to his current rank in 2007, and his first assignment had been to take his team and analyze a debris field in orbit of M6R214. This had been made easier by the fact that he had the ATA gene and was a skilled puddle jumper pilot. "Colonel, we have an incoming signal," Banks began. "It's Vanier, sir." Dorsey and Shepard exchanged looks. The extra security teams arrived at that moment, as did Richard Woolsey. Dorsey gave them hand signals while bringing Woolsey up to speed. As the teams took their positions, Shepard turned to Banks. "On screen," he said. A nearby screen blinked to show a female Vanier standing in what appeared to be a duplicate of Atlantis Operations Center. It took Shepard a second to realize that this was Ran. Ran and the Atlantis expedition had met before, but that was too long of a story to go into now. So he decided to keep it simple. "Hello, Ran." "Greetings, Colonel," she paused. "How are things going there?" "We're doing fine," Shepard said, while Woolsey listened just outside the view of camera. "So, what's this call about?" "There have been some developments here. Good ones. The Vanier are ready to come out of isolation and we want to do better, so we need to have a longer conversation. Is Mr. Woolsey there?" "Yes, I am," Woolsey said as he stepped into the view of the camera. "Good," Ran said with a nod. Shepard stepped back and let Woolsey take the lead. "Tilda, well, this is something new. Tilda, he had a feeling that a lot more changes were about to come to Atlantis and the Pegasus Galaxy." Hive Ship Grand Conqueror Command Center, 06.02.2.022, 1217. Todd, or Guide, as his fellow Wraith called him, was standing in the command center of his brand new flagship Grand Conqueror. It was one of 16 Hive ships and 32 cruisers in orbit of a world they had codenamed Gathering 1. The planet was a lifeless chunk of rock, but it was in a strategic position. He checked the sensors, only to find them empty. The Wraith had been planning this attack for 5 years, and his alliance was only half of the attack force they would be using. So he was waiting for the other half to arrive. There was a beep, and he checked the sensors again. The rest of the fleet had entered range. Another 16 Hive ships and 32 cruisers soon dropped out of hyperspace. They would allow the new arrivals to recover for a couple of minutes. Then they would head for their target and launch an all-out attack. Tilda, they will never see it coming. Tilda, and if they did it right, none of their enemies would survive. The war would be short and decisive. Tilda, and then the galaxy will be ours once again. Tilda. As soon as the cool-down period was over, he turned his second-in-command and ordered the fleet to head out. It was time for the war to begin. 3-2 attacks and a mystery. Alpha Site Gate Room 06.02.2022, 1235. Dr. Radek Zelenka was sitting in the control section of the gate room. In the Milky Way galaxy, the Alpha Site was built into an existing mountain, but the terrain on M7K821 had been flat. Fortunately, the Genii had created a large and open pit mine there. It had been abandoned in 2015 after it ran dry. The creation of the Alpha Site had begun by building a lobby which they called Level 0 at the bottom on that pit. Then they had filled up the pit, and created an artificial hill on top of it. Next, they had built an elevator shaft and stairs from the top of that hill to level 0. They then had simply carved the Alpha site out underneath, with gate room being located on sublevel 12. Besides the main underground complex, there was also an underground hangar that housed 12 F-302 fighters. The two sections were connected by a reinforced underground tunnel. At the moment, the hangar at the end of that tunnel was empty. Lieutenant Colonel Lorne had taken the squadron out for an exercise, while Zelenka was running things in the gate room. Zelenka decided to take a break from the diagnostic he had been running. He leaned back and looked around the room. The reason the Atlantis expedition had been able to build this base was because they had received all sorts of materials and supplies from their allies in this galaxy. If they had been forced to make do with the funds the IOA had allocated to this project, they would have run out of money just after completing the elevator shaft. This mixed nature was clear from the architecture of the gate room. The gate stood in the middle, at the top of a stone ramp. There was no force field, but the Satans had begun mass-producing a model of irises and garage door openers. The bad news was that these didn't work for Stargates in space. The good news was that it did work for surface gates. And this had provided dozens of worlds with a line of defense against the Wraith. As for the gate itself, they were simply using the Stargate and DHD that had already been on the planet when they had arrived. They had, however, wired 3 Genii computers into the DHD. Combined with a standard issue laptop, this allowed the base technicians to run diagnostics on the gate. It was also an upgrade to the gate's memory capacity. Normally, the DHD could only remember the last 50 addresses dialed, and they were in a random order. This homemade dialing computer, however, could log 80 addresses and kept them in chronological order. It was also hardwired to the base's radar and long-range sensors, thus providing the gate room with early warning capacities, if against enemy ships. As for the rest of the room, the walls were made off bricks instead of concrete, and there were no doors out of the room. Instead, there were 2 big arches in the walls. If you arrived through the gate, the left one led to the infirmary. The right one led a round space where there was an elevator and a staircase back to level 0. The rest of the space was a supply room. It had everything the gate room security team could ever need, plus 3 Malpes. The only piece of equipment not in this room was a pair of .303 Vickers machine guns provided by South Africa. These weapons were outdated by Earth standards. But because both the Satans and the Genii could mass-produce the ammo, they were a good fit for the base. Zelenka was about to resume his diagnostic when the long-range sensors sounded the alarm. His fingers flew across his keyboard. When he saw what the sensors had detected, he cursed in his native Czech. 32 Hive ships and 64 Wraith cruisers had entered sensor range. Zelenka hit several keys, and the computer projected the fleet's course. They were headed straight for Atlantis. It was at the point that Major Lou Miller entered the gate room. Miller had been a member of the expedition since the beginning. He had been promoted to captain in 2010 and major in 2013. After that, he had gotten a major lateral promotion, going from being a pilot to leading AR-7. When the Alpha site had been upgraded to its current form, he had been made second in command of the base. Rumor had it that he was on the shortlist for command of the Pegasus Beta site, but that was an issue for another day. As soon as he saw the course projection, Miller began dialing the gate. They had to warm the base. Hive Ship Grand Conqueror Command Center 06.02.2022 2305. The fleet had arrived at Atlantis, but the ancient city ship was not alone. It was located on a world that had simply been called Frozen Planet by the Tory. That planet was surrounded by 5 Tory battleships, 3 Lantean cruisers owned by the Genii, Vanir ships, and a dozen traveler vessels. Guide was not surprised by the development. It was no secret that the Tory had been helping its allies build ships and develop other means to defend themselves against the Wraith. This was why they had taken so long to preparing for this attack. They had known that it would be a tough fight. He turned to Bonewhite, his second-in-command. "Order all ships to deploy their darts." "Yes, Commander," Bonewhite began. 2 minutes until we enter weapons range." The Hive ships began to launch their darts, while the two fleets moved closer. But before they entered weapons range, space rippled and there was a flash. When the light faded, there was something there, something unlike anything Guide had even seen. What the tilde, he turned to Bonewhite to give him an order. But before he could, all hell broke loose. Pentagon Homeworld Command, Command Center 06.02.2022, 2305. Vincent Quinn watched as the Wraith fleet approached the Atlantis Defense Fleet, which had been codenamed Screen 1. If wish Jack and Hank were here. Alas, neither Jack O'Neill or Hank Landry were here. The mandatory retirement age for the U.S. Air Force was 64. Landry had been born in 1945, and O'Neill was from 1952. However, the President of the United States could stretch that until age 68, which was what Henry Hayes had done. Still officially, Landry should have retired in 2013, with O'Neill following in 2020. Using the Roma expedition, Hayes and Quinn had been able to bend the rules to keep the two generals in the uniform. But when the expedition had succeeded in its mission and brought Young and company back, that excuse had stopped working. So both O'Neill and Landry had retired as soon as the debriefing sessions were over, which had left Quinn with two major positions to fill: commander of the SGC and chief of Homeworld Command. He had offered the SGC to Colonel Samantha Carter, but she had respectfully told him that she was preferred to stay in command of the George Hammond. And Quinn figured that Colonel Mitchell didn't want the job either. Mitchell is too much of a frontline man. So he had been forced to go looking for somebody else. After a conversation with Colonel Shepard, he had found Dennis Kersey. Kersey had joined the Atlantis expedition in 2008 as a team leader with rank of major. One of his first missions had been to rescue AR-1 aka Colonel Shepard's team from a diseased Hive ship that had crashed into the oceans of M35 to 117. Kersey had served on Atlantis until 2014. That year, he had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of SG-21. In 2019, he'd been promoted to full bird colonel. His new position as commanding officer of the SGC had come with a promotion to brigadier general. As for the position of chief of Homeworld Command, Quinn had not been able to find a candidate for that job yet. He wanted somebody from within the program, but Jack O'Neill was a hard act to follow. John Shepard or Everett Young would be perfect, but neither of them would take the job in a million's year. So, he had appointed Lieutenant Colonel Paul Davis and Colonel Green to keep things running on a day-to-day basis. Green was on the phone to Kersey, so Quinn and Davis were watching the telemetry from Atlantis together. Both the city and Screen 1 were preparing to open fire. Then suddenly the screen went wobbly before cutting to black. As soon as this happened, Colonel Davis turned to Sergeant Walter Harriman, who was operating one of the workstations. "What just happened?" "Something just overloaded the sensors, sirs," Harriman said. "I'm trying to reset the system, it should." Harriman swallowed the rest of the sentence, and Quinn could see why. Harriman's screen had been showing data. It had been scrambled, but the information had still been flowing. But as Harriman had answered, all the readings had gone dark. They had no way of knowing what had happened. As far as Earth knew, everybody on Atlantis and the ships of Screen 1 might have just wiped out. Stargate Command Gate Room 07.02.2022, 0252. Dennis Kersey was sitting on the ramp to the Stargate. Born in 1972, Kersey was 50 years old. His mother had been born in Nigeria and had dark skin, while his Canadian father was a white as they came. This left Kersey right in the middle of the spectrum, with brown eyes and graying black hair. His youth had been spent on Oahu. His father, Paul, had been a writer for a local paper, while his mother, Tambara, had been a history teacher. They had both retired years ago. Besides Dennis, they had 3 more children and 11 grandchildren. 2 of those had been born to Dennis and his wife, Lucia, an Italian beauty who had stolen his heart many years ago. Tilda, I wish the kids were here. They always help me think. Tilda, alas, he would have to make do without them. For the past couple of hours, they had been trying to contact both the Pegasus Alpha and Beta sites, to no avail. The local Beta site had tried to dial both planets, but had not been able to connect. So he was pondering their next plan. Tilda, it's only a matter of time before the president calls me for advice. Tilda, he closed his eyes and rubbed his eyelids. It was at this point that Master Sergeant Dan Seiler walked in. Sir, he began, the president is calling. Tilda, speak of the devil. Tilda, he opened his eyes and gave the sergeant a nod. He thanked him and headed for his office. When he reached it, Dr. Bill Lee was speaking to the president on the red phone. He was telling the president that Sergeant Seiler had gone to find the brigadier. He told the president that Kersey had arrived and handed over the phone. Mr. President, he said. He sat down at his desk while Dr. Lee left the room. Tilda, something tell me he was here to tell me that things are not making any progress. Tilda Lee was a capable scientist, but in a case of irony, they really needed McKay or Carter on this one. Rush and Wallace were doing what they could. Tilda, thing is, you can only do so much when you're a galaxy away. No matter how smart you are, Tilda. =/ Brigadier Kersey. =/ Quinn began. =/ how are things going there? =/ I'm afraid they are not, sir. Hope Base, Area 51 and all 3 off-world bases in the Milky Way have all be looped in. Tilda Alpha, Beta and Gamma site. Tilda and Dr. Lee is running our effort here in Cheyenne Mountain. He paused. But I'm afraid we're going to have to resort to Plan B, sir. =/ understood. =/ this was their second conversation since the feed had gone dark. They had agreed that Plan B would be sending a ship to Pegasus. =/ who should we send? =/ Most the ships that we have in the Milky Way would need 18 days to get there. Only Spira and Chaser can get there faster, sir, and we need Chaser to defend Earth. Plus, we removed Chaser's Stargate for study at the Gamma site, sir. =/ and we want the option to use the Stargate to send a second wave. How long would it take Spira to get there? =/ 8 days and a little, Mr. President. =/ Spira it is then. I'm going to be meeting the IOA at 0800 local time. =/ Washington, D.C. was 2 hours ahead of Colorado Springs. =/ brief Colonel Vale over subspace, then get some sleep. =/ Understood, sir. The president hung up. Kersey already knew that he was not going to get any sleep this night, no matter what the president said. Tilda, what else is new? Now man up, Dennis. You've got a job to do, Tilda, so he got to work. SATA Planetary Defense Headquarters, Command Center 07.02.2022, 0315. While Brigadier Kersey was briefing Colonel Vale, President Laren walked into the Satan version of Homeworld Command. Named the Planetary Defense Headquarters, it was located in a bunker that began 60 meters underground. There were then 4 floors of base above the command center. The center was a mix of Satan, Genii, Travelers, and Tory technology. At the moment, the place was buzzing with activity. In the middle of this was Major Jack O'Neill. In 2003, an Asgard named Loki had cloned then-Colonel Jack O'Neill. But because of a genetic failsafe, the clone had failed to mature. There had been some shenanigans. But in the end, the clone had begun living a life of his own, away from the Stargate program. That had lasted until 2012, when he had run afoul of the Lucian Alliance. This had been followed by a mission to the Pegasus Galaxy to rescue Colonel Shepard from a pickle. That had been a long story, which had ended with the original O'Neill and Colonel Carter telling their bosses that he had died. In reality, Jack had ended up joining the Satan Air Force in 2013. In the past 9 years, he had climbed the ranks to become a major and commander of a squadron of fighters. When Screen 1 had gone dark, he had been called in. O'Neill was the closest thing they had to an expert on the Tory. Alas, neither Atlantis or the 2 major Tory outposts were responding to their attempts to contact them. "Anything new, Major?" Laren asked. "No, ma'am," O'Neill began. "We're maintaining Condition 1, but the sensor remain." As he said that, the long-range sensors beeped as several vessels entered range. "I had to say it," he turned to one of the soldiers operating the sensors. "Do we have an ID on those ships?" "They're not ours, sir," said Solon Sincha. Sincha had been one of the few survivors of Sata who had served in the same military unit as Ronan Dex. He had been one of the few Satans to return to the planet. "I've run the silhouette through the database, and you're not going to like it, boss." The database included every known profile from the Milky Way and Pegasus Galaxy. "They're Goa'uld Haddock-class vessels, but something is off. They've been modified, sir." "How long until they can open fire?" 7 minutes, sir." Laren and O'Neill exchanged looks. Sata's defenses were about to be put to the test. 4 Spira. USS Spira Colonel Vale's quarters, 08.02.2022. 12:55. Chronologically, Mark Vale was the oldest flesh and blood member of the Stargate program. He had been born in the year 42 BC. His name had been Marcus Valerius, and as soon as Marcus was old enough, he had joined the legions of Rome. There, he had climbed the ranks to become a centurion. His Roman military career had been cut short by an encounter with an ancient stasis chamber. Fortunately, he had been thawed in 2010 AD. After that, he had changed his name to Mark Vale. After a first attempt to rescue Colonel Young and Destiny's crew had gone south for the winter, he had been recruited to lead a second mission. That mission had been called the Nova Roma Expedition. The expedition had succeeded. They had rescued both Destiny's crew and the original rescue team. Their home during the bulk of this adventure had been 8 decks worth of Spira. After the expedition had returned and the debriefings had been done, Vale had taken all of his accumulated leave time. After years off-world, he had wanted to travel good old Earth. He had visited his birth town of Philippi, his friends in New York, where he had been posted before joining the Stargate program, and the Egyptian capital of Cairo. And that had been just the beginning. Vale had decided to visit to every place he had always wanted to see. As this had been taking place, Spira had been undergoing a refit. Tilda, but she is still the same old girl that kept us safe during the expedition. Tilda, during his globetrotting, Vale had considered asking for another posting. But in the end, he had realized that Spira USS or not was his home. After his leave had been over, he had returned to Spira to find that he needed to do some major shuffling. During the expedition, Vale had been the CO. Next came Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Haley, who'd been XO and the Chief Science Officer. Below her was Major Frank Levine, who had been Chief Pilot. Fourth in command had gone to Major Laura Cadman, who had doubled as Chief of Security. And completing the list of bigwigs had been Dr. Allison Porter, who was the ranking civilian. But after they had returned, Colonel Young had gotten his post commanding the Prometheus. This meant that somebody had to succeed him as CO of the Chaser. Recommended by Young and Vale, Jennifer Haley had landed that job, and Frank Levine had become her XO. This had left Spira without an XO, until Vale had convinced the brass to give Laura Cadman a promotion to Lieutenant Colonel and second in command. He had also convinced them to make Porter third in command and Chief Science Officer. Vale was writing all of this down in the ship's log when there was ring at the door. "Enter," he said. The door opened, and Laura Cadman came in. Vale was still getting used to the fact that he now actually had a door. Before her recent refit, Spira's crew quarters had been rooms with wooden walls. There had been 120 cabins. Each had held a bed, a locker for clothes, a desk, and a single chair. They had been tiny spaces, which had been created after the expedition had arrived. But Spira 3.0 was a slightly different animal. She only had a crew of 60, which meant that everybody got twice the space. The new quarters had proper metal bulkheads with proper sound isolation. They also had much better lighting. Before, they had been making do with the lights the ancients had installed. But during the refit, they had been able to install proper lights. The new rooms also came with sound-powered phones for internal communications. Tilde, thank you, U.S. Navy. Tilde, this refit was their handiwork. All the rooms came with electric sockets and network plug-ins. This allowed the recharging of laptops, which could now be connected to the mainframe now. Finally, the Navy had replaced all the furniture and given everybody $100 to buy something to decorate their quarters. It was Vale's purchase that drew Cadman's attention. "Your purchase, boss?" she asked, pointing at a painting mounted next to the door. "Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night," Vale began. "That replica cost me $50, so I spend the rest on some reading material." He pointed a shelf in his new and improved locker. $10 per book at my favorite corner store, so I was able to get 5. The Count of Monte Cristo, A Tale of Two Cities, The Island of Dr. Moreau, Robinson Crusoe, and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. You're into the classics. "Guilty as charged," Vale said, "although I do like the new uniforms better." When they had been on the expedition, they had used a special issue uniform, but now they were using the airman battle uniforms that all the U.S. Air Force used. "But I have a suspicion that you didn't come here to discuss art or fashion, Colonel." "No, sir," Cadman said. "I just got off the phone with Captain Cho's parents. I couldn't tell them much." Lieutenant Tamara Cho had been a member of NR2 from China. She had promoted to captain and reassigned to the Sun Tzu, and she had not been the only team member they had lost. 2 of Vale's people had stayed aboard Destiny when everybody else had gone home. It had been a longer story. But all that mattered now was that Dr. Alex Bennett and Private John White had volunteered to finish the original mission, and that it had left NR2 with just one member, Dr. Nikita Aronov. "You did what you could," Vale said. "How are we looking on the roster?" "Well, the brass still thinks we should change the team names, since the expedition is over." "That is so not happening," Vale said. He knew that NR was short for Nova Roma, but he simply didn't care. "Tilde time to get work, Mark. Tilde now, about that team rosters." "NR1 is still the same. You, Gial, Porter, and Tizalo." Cadman handed his a clipboard with the roster. The bulk of Spira's crew was human, but Vale had put his foot down and insisted that some of the Alliance people were simply crucial to the ship. Except for the promotions. Gial was a Nakai who has been promoted to security and give the rank of corporal. Staff Sergeant Tizalo was an Ursini who had been chief pilot, until Frank Levine had arrived, but when Levine had left, Vale had made him chief pilot again. And moving on to NR2, which was basically wiped out by the transfers. Haley had been the leader of NR2. Now, that job belonged to Dr. Nikita Aronov, one of Spira's archaeologists. So, how did we fill the giant gap in the roster? Xander Henderson as team engineer and Hetty McConnelly as team botanist. Of course, transferring Hetty left a hole in NR5. She sat down on the chair that came with the desk. And Staff Sergeant Vilazzo as the team medic. Vilazzo was a Nakai male who had served on the medical team on both Chaser and Spira. He's still getting used to being chief medical officer, but he'll do fine. Speaking of people who are settling in, how is Private Wallace doing? Fine. Private First Class John White had been a member of NR3 from South Africa. He had been replaced by another South African Private First Class, Richard Wallace. Wallace was the team's security officer. Before joining the armed forces, he worked in his father's garage. so he was good with tools as well. Next on the list was NR4, but that team had not been changed. However, Carl Grogan, the team leader, had been promoted to major. Which only leaves us with NR5, Vale said. Right, Sinara had been promoted to team leader, a Zivolo female. She was the second archaeologist aboard. And Vladimir Golov is now second in command. Golov was a Russian soldier who had also been promoted from corporal to staff sergeant. As for Heady Place, we've received another Scottish scientist, Dr. Dylan Calhoun. The information dump done, Cadman leaned back and sighed. Vale scanned the new roster and added it to the log. His new and bigger desk came with a flatbed scanner. Vale saved the entry and turned off his laptop. With the paperwork done, they could focus on the important part of the equation. Brigadier Kersey had briefed him, and then he had briefed Spira's crew. 53 humans and 7 aliens. Then they had set course for Atlantis at maximum speed. So, how is morale out there? It's in the dumps, Cadman began. If these were the good old days, you'd be sending them out to loot and pillage at this point. Yeah, modern-day generals tend to frown on that sort of thing, Vale said with a smile. Time to move on to Plan B. Let's make a tour of the ship and take it from there. We can always go for the loot and pillage option later. Sounds like a plan to me. The two of them left his quarters and got to work. USS Spira Bridge, 08.02.2022, 14:30. Dr. Dylan Calhoun gasped as he walked onto the bridge of Spira. He and Richard Wallace had arrived by Stargate yesterday. In order to keep from raising any red flags, they had traveled to Stargate Command the old-fashioned way instead of using a teleporter. So he had been exhausted by the time he arrived on Spira. He had gone to bed and was only now getting to explore the ship. Spira was not the biggest ship in the fleet, but it was an ancient vessel. One of the science consoles was empty, so Calhoun sat down at it. He was checking the options on the scanners when 2 people came in. One was a Caucasian woman with blonde hair, wearing the rank of lieutenant colonel, and the other was Caucasian male with brown eyes and matching eyes. This man was a full bird colonel. Calhoun figured that this were Laura Cadman and Mark Vale. So, this is the infamous former Roman centurion, Tilda. The two of them were chatting and talked to the people manning the bridge. Calhoun knew what had happened in the Pegasus Galaxy, and he knew that the mood on the ship was far from good. There's nothing you can do about it, Dylan. So he went back to studying the console. While Cadman was talking to Sergeant T. Zalo, Vale approached him. Dr. Calhoun, I presume. That's me, Calhoun began, while turning his chair to face the colonel. Here we go, for reasons. He had a feeling that this conversation was not going to end well. And you must be Colonel Vale. Well, Doctor, how do you like our little ancient siege ship? It's amazing, but I'm going to have to brush up on my Latin. Yeah, even if I had to do some studying. And I spoke Latin every day, but there were plenty of differences between Latin and ancient. So, how did your uncle take it when you told him that you joined the Stargate program? Well, Calhoun bit his lower lip. As he had expected, the reason had surfaced pretty fast. You didn't tell him, did you? Vale smiled at him. But figuring it out wasn't that hard. I've read Dr. Rush's personnel file, which said that he had a sister. She was listed with her married name, Calhoun. It also noted that the date of her death. He paused. I also read your file before rubber stamping it for the short list for this posting. Oh, Calhoun paused. So did you hire me because... He swallowed the rest of the sentence. No, I recommended you for the position because you're a top-notch chemist and theoretical astrophysicist. And if you don't want to talk to you Uncle Nicholas, that's fine with me. He isn't exactly the warm and fuzzy type. Yeah, after he graduated from Oxford, Uncle Nick left for the States and never looked back. Things between him and Mom were ugly at the end, he paused. So, what do we do now? Well, You have a science console to study, and I have a ship to tour." "Yes, sir," Calhoun said. Calhoun turned back to his console, while Vale joined Cadman. The two of them were talking as they walked out of the bridge. "Tilda, something tells me that the two of them are going to end up talking about me. Tilda, but there was nothing that he could do about it, nor could he blame them. So he went back to work. USS Spira Infirmary, 08.02.2022, 1438. They were in the infirmary, where morale was actually not that bad. Sergeant Vilazzo had the medical staff doing checkups and running several tests. Cadman decided that now was as good a time as any to bring up the subject of Dylan Calhoun. Tilda better get it over with. Tilda, she had overheard the conversation between Calhoun and Vale, but she also knew how things looked. "Sir, permission to speak freely." "Granted," Vale began. "But let me guess, you want to know if I recommended Calhoun because he's Nicholas Rush's nephew. And for the record, I knew you were eavesdropping on our conversation." He paused. "To answer your question, no, I'm a soldier, not a politician. I hire people based on skills, not connections. You realize Rush is going to be pissed when he discovers his nephew is here, and that you didn't tell him." "Yeah, well, as that old movie goes. Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn." "Good to know." Cadman smiled, and they continued their tour of the Spira. M7K, 821 Field, 08.02.2022, 1440. While Spira was on her way to the Pegasus Galaxy, Evan Lorne and Radek Zelenka were leading a team across the fields of M7K 821. Mere minutes after Atlantis had done dark, a Goa'uld Haddock-class ship had appeared above the base. At least, it had appeared as a Goa'uld ship at first glance. But an analysis had revealed that it was actually a hybrid vessel. The Haddock-class ship had been upgraded with both ancient and Wraith technology. The ship had fired a single shot, which had totaled the base's communication systems. Zelenka had led efforts to fix it, but the system was beyond repair with the supplies they had on base. Alas, getting the supplies they needed was complicated by the fact that the alien ship proceeded to teleport away the Stargate. They had analyzed the signal, but it was an unknown system, which was why it had been able to get past the jammers installed in the gate room. The gate snatched, the ship had jumped away into hyperspace. Tilda leaving us totally cut off, Tilda Lorne thought. After 2 days of attempting repairs, they had decided it was time to move on. So at 1200 hours, they had left Miller in charge of the base and headed out. The old Genii mine had needed workers, so the Genii had built a settlement in a cave network, which was where the team was heading. They knew that if they found a Genii transmitter, it would probably be in bad shape, and even if it worked, it would probably be short range. Alas, it was the only plan they had. "So," Lorne began, "what do we tell the brass when they ask?" "Ask what?" Zelenka said. "Well, I'm thinking positive, and if we manage to pull this off, the brass is going to ask why the bad guys didn't blow us up," Lorne said. "I'd like to have an answer for them." "I do have a theory, but you're not going to like it." "Tell me anyway." "When I analyzed our readings on the attackers, I realized that it wasn't just the readings on the ship that were off." Zelenka paused as they reached the mouth of the cave network. "There was something wrong about the crew as well, so I asked Carson to take a closer look at the readings. He agreed that there was indeed something off about the crew, but he couldn't tell me details." "That's not a theory, Radek." "I'm getting there." Carson noticed that there was radiation. They reached the communications building. "I'm not sure, but I think it's the same kind of radiation that we saw when an alternate version of the Daedalus showed up, and we also saw this when an alternate Rodney McKay zapped in." "Wait, you think this is an alternate Goa'uld vessel?" They entered the building. "You're right, I don't like that." Lorne found the transmitter. As expected, it was far from pristine. "Tilda, but we don't have a plan B, Tilda, so they got to work."